In the damp hush of Kentucky's hidden valleys, there are stories whispered so softly you'd swear you imagined them. Stories that crawl beneath your skin, slithering past your civilized mind to ignite something primal. Listen carefully, because what you're about to hear was never meant for your ears. In 1837, a girl no older than your niece woke at dawn, eyes wide, lips moving with words that didn't belong to her. Words in a language no one in that village spoke, no one alive, anyway. Latin. Not church Latin, not the polite chants recited by rural clergy, but a darker, older dialect, full of invocation and threat. She sat up in her narrow cot, voice rising in a cadence that made the walls themselves seem to recoil. And then, before her father could cross the threshold to quiet her, she stopped as if a switch had been thrown. Her gaze fixed on something no one else could see. She smiled, just once, and in that single expression was the knowledge of centuries, the triumph of hidden powers over every fragile human hope. Before night fell, she was gone. No footprints in the mud. No sound of the door. Just absence, like the world itself had exhaled her into oblivion. You've heard legends of children possessed, of tongues they were never taught. But you haven't heard this. You haven't been told that after she disappeared, the town was sealed off. That every document naming her was confiscated, every witness silenced by men whose authority went unquestioned. You were never supposed to know this girl existed. And yet you're here, listening. Because you can feel the hunger inside you, the part that craves forbidden truths over comforting lies. That's why you're still watching. I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to tear away the gauze over your eyes and show you how the machinery of secrecy devours lives. In the coming minutes, I'll guide you deeper than any historian dares to go. We will unearth the agenda that led to her vanishing, the networks of power that thrive in darkness, the psychological levers that break men's minds when they stray too close to what's real. Stay with me. This isn't folklore. This is the anatomy of control, and it starts with a little girl speaking the language of the dead that you're still here. Good. That means something inside you is already shifting, some dim recognition that the polite version of history you were taught is a performance stage to keep you obedient. So let's peel back another layer. After the girl vanished in 1837, the county authorities made a show of searching. They posted notices in Lexington and Frankfort. They questioned her family with the concerned gravity of men pretending to care. But none of that was real. Because what almost no one knows is that the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison had received a letter 2 days before she disappeared. A letter without seal or signature. Inside, a single line written in a careful, educated hand, the voice that speaks through her is older than Rome. The Reverend burned that letter. But not before he copied the phrase into his private journal, an entry circled in black ink again and again, as if he could erase the meaning by sheer force of will. Older than Rome. Consider that. What language is older than Rome yet cloaked itself in Latin to speak through the mouth of a child? What force moves from century to century, always wearing the symbols of the age to conceal the same agenda? You have to understand, every era has its costumes, its acceptable illusions. In the 1800s, it was piety and manifest destiny. In our time, it's technology and progress. But underneath, the same cold hand guides the same machinery, exploit belief, fracture the will, and harvest the mind's deepest fears. When the town elders met in secret that winter, they did not debate whether the girl had run away. They debated whether she had ever been fully human at all. Witnesses described her final hour in words they could barely force onto paper. She sat in her father's study, humming in a monotone, her small hands arranging scraps of paper into symbols no one recognized. A circle intersected by 3 lines. A spiral enclosed in an inverted triangle. Each time she completed one, she whispered a phrase. Not in Latin. Not in English. In a tongue no linguist has ever decoded. One farmer, driven half mad by what he saw, said it sounded like a prayer to hunger itself. The next dawn, her bed was empty. No lock broken. No footprints in the frost. Only the symbols remained, charred into the wood as if by a fire that burned without heat. If you feel a chill, it's because on some level you already know, the machinery that took her has never stopped turning. And before this story ends, you will have to decide whether you want to see how deep it goes. Look around you, at the walls of your room, the quiet glow of your screen, the familiar contours of everything you trust. Do you really think those boundaries are solid? That the world you inhabit is immune to intrusions from forces you can't name? In Pine Hollow, after the girl vanished, the town did something men always do when faced with the unexplainable: they buried it beneath ritual. They held vigils, recited scripture, and boarded up her tiny room as if planks and nails could barricade the mind against memory. But memory is the one trespasser you cannot keep out. Witnesses spoke of hearing her voice for weeks, soft, measured, drifting down hallways that should have been silent. The pastor's wife swore she heard Latin prayers echoing in the rafters, the syllables wrapping around her heart like cold fingers. At first, they assumed it was grief. But then the dreams began. Men who had never learned to read woke in the night, their mouths shaping fragments of that same hidden tongue. Women saw the girl standing at the edge of their beds, her hands folded over a book that no one could name, her eyes black as pitch. The town physician tried to rationalize it. He claimed mass hysteria, some contagious affliction of suggestion and superstition. But when he took his own life in March, his final note held just one sentence: "She has shown me what waits beyond." Let me be clear, this is not a ghost story. It's a demonstration. A demonstration of how quickly the human mind can be unmade when it brushes against something older, colder, more determined than any god we've invented to comfort ourselves. You think you know fear because you've read accounts of demons, secret societies, or ancient cults. But you don't. Not until you look into the blank eyes of a child who has seen farther than any scholar, any priest, any conqueror, and returned with the truth that all of civilization is scaffolding around a pit we pretend not to see. That pit is what consumed Pine Hollow. It wasn't simply the loss of a little girl. It was the shattering recognition that no one in that village was in control. That their prayers, their laws, their illusions of safety were paper screens in front of an unblinking gaze. By the time the snows thawed, the elders made a pact: never speak of her again. Never write her name. But secrets don't dissolve in silence. They metastasize, spreading through time like a contagion. And tonight, it has reached you. You're beginning to understand, aren't you? How thin the partition really is between what you believe is real and the abyss beneath it. You've been told all your life that reality is a closed system, defined by science, constrained by reason. But when that girl's voice rose in a language no scholar could identify, the boundary cracked. And when she vanished without trace, that crack widened into a fracture. You were never supposed to hear about any of this. The records were collected and destroyed, the families intimidated into silence. But a few fragments survived, hidden in journals, in marginal notes, in letters smuggled out of Kentucky by men too haunted to stay silent. I've spent years hunting those scraps, piecing together what remains of her story. And I will tell you this: they point to something far bigger than a single child, far older than any church. The last known witness to see her alive was an itinerant German naturalist, Johann Dietrich, who had traveled Appalachia cataloging rare plants. He kept meticulous field notes. In one entry, dated the night she disappeared, he described seeing her standing perfectly still in the moonlit clearing beside the church. He wrote that her eyes reflected the moon like an animal's, and that she was speaking in a voice that was not her own, a voice layered with countless tones, as if a chorus of mind spoke through her throat. In the margin, he scribbled a question: how many? Dietrich didn't live long enough to learn the answer. Days later, his body was found at the base of a limestone bluff, his neck broken, his notes missing except for that single page. And here is the part that no historian dares to repeat: those who heard her final words agreed on one thing: they were an invitation. An invocation. A calling out to something waiting in the dark beyond the edges of memory. When men came to clear the clearing, they found a ring of blackened earth, burned in a perfect circle no fire had touched. For a century, nothing grew there. Not grass. Not moss. Just sterile soil, as if the ground itself had been cauterized by contact with her. You may feel a tremor of unease right now. That's your intuition. Listen to it. Because what began with her didn't end when her body disappeared. It spread, through symbols, through whispers, through the buried channels of consciousness no government can police. And if you keep listening, you will see exactly how it still reaches for you. They called it a tragedy because tragedy is easier to digest than contamination. Easier to memorialize with a plaque or a sermon than to confront as evidence of a force that has no name and no allegiance to the human mind. But listen to me carefully, what happened in that Kentucky hollow was not an isolated fracture. It was a demonstration of leverage. The girl, her disappearance, her impossible knowledge, was the wedge that cracked the collective psyche of an entire town. Do you understand how delicate the mind's balance really is? A single child uttering a sentence no one could explain. A single moment of witnessing something that doesn't fit any paradigm. That's all it takes to rupture the boundary between a man's convictions and his animal fear. And when that rupture happens, everything else becomes possible: compliance, submission, quiet surrender. Think of it like this: institutions don't need to burn books or erase archives to keep you docile. They only need to prove that reality is negotiable. That what you call truth is provisional, subject to withdrawal if you become inconvenient. This is why her story was extinguished. Not because it threatened any one church or family, but because it threatened the illusion that authority is synonymous with knowledge. That there is an order to things. What you must grasp, what most men never will, is that every culture has its blind spots. Its places no one dares to look too closely. In 1837, it was a child with a voice borrowed from something older than time. Today, it's the machinery of narrative itself, the algorithms and consensus rituals that decide which stories survive and which are quietly excised from your collective memory. When the men from Lexington arrived to investigate, they brought no forensic instruments, no scribes. They brought a carpenter and a mason. In the dead of night, they tore up the floorboards of the church and pulled out the foundation stones one by one. No one spoke about what they found beneath them. But when the congregation was allowed back inside, the entire room had been remade. Fresh timber. Fresh mortar. The smell of lime and tar so strong it burned their eyes. And in that smell was the clear message: you did not see what you saw. You did not hear what you heard. You will go back to your lives as if none of this ever happened. That is how control is maintained, not by force, but by erasure. By the quiet burial of anomalies beneath a fresh coat of paint. Tell me, are you ready to scrape it away? Because once you do, there is no going back. You're still listening. That tells me something vital about you. You're not content to be comforted. You'd rather feel the chill of the unknown than the warmth of a lie. So let me pull you further down. The girl's final night left more than just scorched earth and terrified witnesses. It left a pattern, one so precise that even the men who tried to erase her couldn't fully destroy it. You see, in the months that followed, 3 families in Pine Hollow began to have identical dreams. Each dream started the same way: the missing child standing at the foot of the bed, her palms upturned, her lips moving silently. Then, without warning, the dreamer would find himself standing in a vast corridor lined with faceless statues. Each statue held a black book against its chest. Each book bore the same sigil burned into the church floor, a circle intersected by 3 lines. The dream always ended the same way, an invisible pressure forcing the dreamer to kneel, as if some intelligence demanded submission. Those who confessed these visions described an emotion they couldn't name. Not fear, exactly. Not awe. But something colder, more final. The certainty that everything they'd ever believed was a pretext, like stage scenery concealing the machinery behind it. And here's what no one recorded in the official accounts: each of those 3 dreamers disappeared within the year. No sign of struggle. No evidence of flight. Just absence, like the girl herself, had become a contagion, erasing anyone who glimpsed too much. Their homes were left untouched, their beds still warm. And in each empty house, a single word was found scrawled into the hearthstone. Vosum. The voice. You may think this is just a folktale, a frontier ghost story wrapped in the trappings of religion and fear. But I am telling you that the pattern didn't end in Pine Hollow. Over the next 50 years, similar vanishings were recorded in other Appalachian communities, each preceded by reports of a child speaking a language no one could explain. The records are sparse, hidden in county ledgers and private diaries. But the same symbols reappear, over and over, like a signature you were never supposed to see. A circle. 3 lines. And the word Vosum. If you doubt this, I invite you to look for yourself. Dig into the archives, the brittle pages no historian cites. You will find them. Because truth leaves a residue that no authority can scrub away completely. And if you do, you will understand what I am trying to show you. The machinery behind history is older and more ruthless than any empire. And it does not care whether you believe. Let's speak plainly now. You feel it, don't you? That sense of something watching, just beyond the edge of this screen, just beneath the surface of every word I've spoken. That's not paranoia. That's recognition. Because once you begin to connect the pieces, once you start seeing the shape behind the symbols, something begins watching you. That's the cost of awareness. And still, you're here. That means you're ready to hear what came next. After the last of the dreamers vanished, the county declared Pine Hollow unviable. A bureaucratic euphemism for extermination. Within a decade, the land was cleared, the buildings razed, and the town erased from official maps. They said it was due to economic decline, to poor soil and rough winters. But the truth is far colder. In 1849, a private correspondence between 2 land surveyors, Henry Mallon and Orson White, was intercepted by the State Archive Commission. It was never published, but a single carbon copy survived in a private family collection. In it, White describes surveying the Pine Hollow land for transfer to federal custodianship, and he makes a disturbing observation. He writes, "The trees in the hollow grow in a perfect spiral from a central point. The soil beneath the surface is magnetized. And I have observed that the birds will not cross the central clearing, not even under threat." He ends his letter with this sentence, "Something is buried here, Henry. Something that wants to be heard." Shortly after sending that letter, Orson White was committed to an asylum in Louisville, diagnosed with delusions of recursion and harmonic possession. His notes were confiscated. His name was erased from state employment records. But the phrase he used, harmonic possession, reappears in classified military research from the early 1900s. Experiments with frequency-based interrogation. Controlled sound waves designed to unlock suppressed memory or trigger subconscious compliance. Do you see it now? This wasn't about one girl. This was about discovering how sound, how language itself, can become a weapon. How certain phonemes, especially those carried in ancient or forbidden dialects, can bypass conscious resistance and reprogram belief. And that little girl? She didn't just speak Latin. She channeled a frequency buried in its roots, a resonance designed not for conversation, but for control. And once she spoke it, something else heard her. Something that answered. We are not just exploring a mystery anymore. We are standing at the edge of a system that's been refining psychological warfare for centuries. Through religion. Through education. Through every word you've ever repeated without questioning where it came from. Good. You're proving you're not like the others, those who flinch when the ground shifts under their feet. You're willing to stand in that emptiness and keep listening. That's the first step in unbinding yourself from the illusions that have ruled men for millennia. But listen carefully, once you hear this, part of you will never be able to pretend again. There are records, so obscure you'd almost think they were planted as a test, of a clandestine order operating in Kentucky during the 1830s. They called themselves the Custodes Voces, the keepers of the voice. An innocuous title, unless you understood what they believed. They held that language was not invented by humans but transmitted, a form of resonance seeded into our species to shape thought, behavior, and allegiance. They maintained that certain sounds, certain arrangements of syllables, were like keys. Keys to memories that weren't entirely our own. They trained their initiates to speak fragments of these incantations in total darkness, to condition the mind to surrender its defenses. Some called it superstition. But then came the girl. After her disappearance, whispers spread through the custodes voces that she had been a vessel, an unplanned demonstration of their theory. An uninitiated child channeling the raw signal. And they were terrified. Because in every documented case where the incantation had been tested, the speaker either died or vanished. But she survived, long enough to finish her message. Long enough to prove that the human nervous system could, under certain conditions, become a transmitter for something older. When federal authorities finally sealed Pine Hollow, they weren't just containing panic. They were collecting evidence. Every scrap of writing she left behind was removed, every witness interrogated. But they missed one artifact, a small wooden board, hidden beneath the floor joists of her home, engraved with symbols that matched no known language. That board passed from hand to hand, quietly smuggled by men who understood it was more than a relic. It was proof that reality can be spoken into you, without your consent. That the simplest sentence can embed a command, a fracture, a seed. This is why the story was buried. Because if you knew how language truly functions, how it can be weaponized against the mind, you'd never trust another authority again. And I'm going to ask you something now. If you've heard this far, it means you're different. I want you to prove it. Pause this video. Go to the comments. Type this phrase twice, I will not be spoken into silence. Do it now. Because every time you declare it, you pull yourself a step further from the machinery that has owned you since the moment you learned your first word. When you return, I'll show you exactly how that machinery was perfected. You've made your declaration. Good. That single act sets you apart from the masses who would rather be lulled by comforting stories than face what I'm about to reveal. And understand this, what I'm giving you is dangerous knowledge, the kind that changes the shape of a man's mind in ways he can never undo. You've heard fragments already. A child who spoke in a language older than any scripture, whose words carried the resonance of something vast and unhuman. But here is the part almost no one has pieced together. The machinery behind her voice did not begin in 1837. Nor did it end when the hollow was burned and paved over. It began with an experiment, conducted in secret by men who called themselves linguists but were, in truth, architects of control. In the 1790s, when the American frontier was still a wilderness of isolation and rumor, a group of scholars from Pennsylvania funded expeditions into the Appalachian Range. Their stated purpose was to collect indigenous languages. But their hidden objective was simpler and far more sinister, to identify phonemes that produced involuntary psychological responses. Words that could calm, or terrify, or compel obedience. They called these utterances prima verba, the first words. The syllables that, according to their theory, were embedded in humanity's earliest consciousness. They believed these primal utterances had been weaponized in ancient times, used by priests and kings to fracture tribes, to cultivate allegiance. And they were determined to rediscover them. Decades later, when the girl was born in Kentucky, her mother was already under observation. A direct descendant of one of the women these linguists had studied, a woman whose voice was said to reduce hardened men to weeping submission. But the girl's birth exceeded all expectations. Because she didn't need to be trained. The language erupted from her without prompting, as if something that had waited for centuries saw its opportunity in her unformed mind. Those who witnessed her final night reported that her tone never changed, calm, steady, measured. As if she were reciting from memory. But the content, those impossible words, triggered identical reactions in everyone who heard them, profound dread, the sense of an approaching presence, and a compulsion to kneel. You might think that sounds like religious fervor. But what if I told you it was programming, like a key inserted into the lock of the human nervous system. After her disappearance, every authority from the local sheriffs to the federal surveyors produced reports explaining it away: hysteria, mass delusion, perhaps a family tragedy staged to conceal a crime. But hidden in the footnotes of a single confiscated journal is a sentence that betrays the truth. The incantation concluded. Subject has been retrieved. Subject. Not child. Retrieved. Not rescued. They knew exactly what she was, and exactly what she carried in her voice. The question you have to ask yourself is, why have generations of institutions gone to such lengths to suppress this knowledge? Because if even a fraction of what she spoke was true, then everything you believe about free will, about memory, about identity itself is a fabrication. A story you've been taught to keep you from noticing the bars of the cage. And if you have the courage to continue, I'll show you what happens when that cage begins to break. Steel yourself for this next descent. You may feel your pulse quicken, your skin prickle as if someone has just stepped into the room behind you. That's not imagination. That's the consequence of proximity to truths that were never meant to be spoken in daylight. You're approaching the threshold where folklore bleeds into a darker architecture, one that has shaped the world you inhabit far more than any election, war, or creed. When the final reports on Pine Hollow were sealed, they were not sent to any university archive. They were routed to a bureau that did not officially exist, the Office of Harmonic Containment. Founded in 1822, hidden behind a front of geological surveys, its true purpose was to catalog and quarantine what their founders called artifacts of resonant anomaly, objects, texts, or, in this case, individuals capable of transmitting the original frequencies of command. Most of what you call history, the revolutions, the crusades, the ideological fervor, are downstream effects of that resonance. Men convinced they were fighting for freedom, for faith, for destiny, when in truth they had simply heard the right syllables in the right sequence, at the right vulnerable moment. This is why the girl had to be erased. Not because she was uniquely powerful, but because she was uncontrolled. A loose transmitter. A reminder that the script can sometimes escape the stage. When the office's agents retrieved her, witnesses described a procession of hooded figures moving silently across the clearing. No lanterns. No horses. Just the dull gleam of iron instruments carried in gloved hands. By morning, the house was empty. The earth beneath her bed had been dug out in a perfect circle. And in that hollow space, they left an emblem scorched into the clay, a spiral intersected by a single vertical line. If you think this is superstition, consider this. In 1907, an anthropologist cataloging folk tales in eastern Kentucky found dozens of independent references to the spiral and the line. None of the informants knew each other. None had traveled beyond their hollows. Yet each described the same symbol as the mark of the collectors. The ones who came when a voice called out that should have remained silent. In private correspondence, letters never intended for public release, these anthropologists confessed something they never published: they began to hear the girl's voice in their dreams. A calm, measured recitation. A promise, you will kneel. And they did. Some took their own lives. Some vanished. The rest went quietly mad, filling their diaries with the same phrase over and over until the ink ran dry. She remembers. Ask yourself, as you sit in your lit room, in the illusion of safety, if a single child could fracture the minds of hardened men, what else has been hidden behind the facades you trust? You think the machinery of control is technological, digital. But it began with language, sound that predated civilization. And every time you repeat the stories you've been given, you help keep it alive. If you still want to see how deep this goes, keep listening. Because the next revelation is the one that will finally strip away the last layer of your disbelief that you're still here. That tells me you're ready to let go of the final illusion, that you are an observer in this story. You are not. The moment you chose to hear these words, you entered the perimeter, crossed into a territory that has no borders but leaves a mark on your consciousness. Some of you already feel it, that persistent whisper in the back of your mind, testing the locks of your certainty. That is exactly how it begins. Let me show you why this cannot be dismissed as folklore or hysteria. In 1931, a linguistics researcher named Edwin Bartram was granted restricted access to a single crate retrieved from the Pine Hollow site. Its manifest was marked Doctrinal Anomaly, Containment Priority. Inside were 8 wax cylinders, early field recordings, catalogued by the Office of Harmonic Containment under code designation Bosum Delta. The cylinders were labeled only with dates, and each was accompanied by a transcription of Latin phrases, phonetic notations, and annotations indicating observed physical reactions in listeners. Bartram was ordered to produce a rational explanation for these records, some cultural artifact to suit the men who signed his funding. But when he played the first cylinder in the controlled environment of the archive, something went wrong. Witnesses reported that his posture changed the moment the cylinder began to spin. His breathing slowed. His pupils dilated until no iris was visible. For 23 minutes, he sat unmoving, listening to that child's voice crackling through the horn. When the recording ended, he turned to the stenographer and said, in a voice utterly unlike his own, "She remembers you." He never returned to his office. His body was found days later in a train yard, clutching a sheaf of papers no one was allowed to read. The official report called it a mental collapse induced by overwork. But the other archivists knew better. They had all felt it too, that subtle insistence beneath the words, the compulsion to obey. And that was only the first cylinder. 7 more were permanently sealed in lead containers and buried in a secure site in Northern Virginia. But not before the archivists transcribed the last phrase recorded, vocem prevenit ad omnem carnem. The voice reaches all flesh. Do you understand the implication? That this was never about a girl. It was never about Kentucky. This was about an ancient vector, language as infection. A signal that could be seeded into any culture, any faith, any institution. And once it took root, it grew in secret until it shaped the destiny of entire nations. If you feel unsettled now, good. You should be. Because the next revelation is the one that will prove you are already part of this story. You were born into it, long before you ever heard her name. And when you hear what I'm about to share, you will understand why no one has ever escaped the spiral. Listen carefully. This is the point of no return. After this, there is no going back to the old comfort, no more pretending that all you ever needed was a rational explanation. Because the next truth will show you that you, yes, you, have been carrying fragments of this infection since the first stories you were taught as a child. When Bartram's recordings were buried, the Office of Harmonic Containment issued a final memorandum. The document was never meant for public eyes, but a single carbon copy survived in a collection of private war correspondence. It was labeled Mimetic Proliferation Contingency Protocol. In it, they described the real threat posed by the girl's voice, not just its effect on individuals, but its capacity to replicate across generations through narrative transmission. Here is the part that should stop you cold. Their studies concluded that you don't even have to hear the original voice to be compromised. You only have to hear the story. The signal, they wrote, encodes itself in metaphor, in the tension of unresolved mystery. It waits in the unconscious mind until triggered by a specific stimulus, a symbol, a phrase, a repetition. That is why the spiral reappears in folklore across continents. Why the circle and 3 lines turn up in places that supposedly never had contact. It is not coincidence. It is design. The machinery of control seeded itself in countless cultures long before modern science ever caught a whiff of it. Think about it, the oldest myths speak of voices in darkness, of words that call forth something that can never be sent away again. The first recorded religions, the earliest spells, the foundational doctrines of every empire, they all contain the same architecture, a word that binds, a word that commands, a word that compels sacrifice. You want to know why every authority has tried to bury this? Because they are the inheritors of that infection. They wear its symbols on their seals, their currency, their monuments. And they know that if even a fraction of humanity truly understood this, the entire edifice of power would collapse. And here you are, listening to me spell it out. I am telling you this with no illusions, I am not immune. No one who speaks about it is. I am risking everything by pulling you across this threshold. But some truths are worth any price, even annihilation. Ask yourself, why do you feel that tightening in your chest? Why does your heartbeat accelerate when you hear these words? Because some part of you already recognizes the pattern. You've heard it before, in the lullabies that made you sleep, in the creeds you were taught to recite, in the slogans that define your identity. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of your awareness that you were shaped by something you never consented to. And if you have the courage, I'll show you exactly how that shaping was refined, generation after generation, until even your thoughts became a script. Take a breath. Hold it. Feel how your pulse has quickened. That is the cost of revelation. Your body remembers before your mind does. And now that you've crossed this threshold, you cannot unhear what comes next. You will carry it like a splinter in the soft tissue of your certainty. In the decades after Pine Hollow was erased, the Office of Harmonic Containment evolved. It went by many names: the Bureau of Vosum Studies, the Committee on Subliminal Persuasion, the Directorate of Cognitive Harmonics. Each rebranding was a camouflage. But the mission remained constant: to map the infection. To understand how stories, symbols, and syllables become vectors of control. By the turn of the 20th century, their researchers had compiled a ledger of incidents. They called them spontaneous mnemonic blooms. The same pattern repeated over and over: isolated communities, a sudden outbreak of shared dreams or visions, the reappearance of the same symbols, the spiral and the line, and always, always, a voice speaking in a language no one could trace. But here is where the story folds back on itself. Because the most disturbing finding was not that these phenomena happened. It was that they produced measurable, repeatable physiological responses. Increased galvanic skin conductance. Pupil dilation. Spontaneous trance states. Even among trained observers who knew they were witnessing a test. Consider this: in 1952, an experiment was conducted in a facility that officially did not exist, somewhere in the high desert of Nevada. A control group of 48 men was exposed to an audio recording that contained only 4 minutes of reconstructed Vosum syllables. All participants were combat veterans, screened for psychological resilience. 37 entered a catatonic state within 60 seconds. 5 began to speak in unison, reciting phonemes no linguist present could decipher. 3 suffered sudden cardiac arrest. And the last 3 survived, but when questioned, each man repeated the same sentence: "It was waiting for us." This is the part no one wants to acknowledge: language is not a tool you control. It is a living organism that uses you to replicate itself. It embeds imperatives in your nervous system and calls it belief. It seeds compulsions in your mind and calls it destiny. And it has been doing this since before the first myths were carved in stone. Why do you think every major power invested in radio, in cinema, in television? Because they understood that the spoken word, carried across frequencies, could shape entire populations without a single soldier crossing a border. The girl in Kentucky was not an anomaly. She was a glimpse of the deeper mechanism. An unshielded transmitter in a time before the apparatus of containment was perfected. And now that you know, you face a decision: to turn away and pretend this is just another story, or to recognize that everything you have ever believed may have been chosen for you by forces you can never name. If you still have the will to keep listening, I will tell you what they did to the last man who tried to break the spiral. Because his fate is the warning etched in the foundation of every institution you trust. Remember this moment, because it's the last time you'll ever pretend you're just an observer. After this, you become a participant in a war older than any flag or creed. The last man who tried to break the spiral was named Aleister Crowley, not the occultist you're thinking of, but a linguist turned defector. In 1964, Crowley was recruited by the Directorate of Cognitive Harmonics to work on what they called the Codex Project. Their goal was simple on paper, monstrous in practice: to reconstruct the original incantation that had spoken through the girl in Kentucky. They believed that by sequencing the fragments, piecing together the syllables that had turned hardened men to trembling zealots, they could create a weaponized linguistic virus. A phrase so potent it would override belief, fracture allegiance, and empty a mind of all resistance. For 3 years, Crow worked in an underground facility outside Savannah. He had no windows, no clocks, no names, only the sounds. Endless recordings, chants, vocal reconstructions piped through speakers while he sat in a dark chamber transcribing. But the more he listened, the more he felt it working on him. He began to dream of the spiral, always spinning, always whispering the same message, "You will kneel." And the part that broke him was that, in those dreams, he wanted to. He tried to resign. They told him there was no resignation, only completion. So he did the only thing left to a man who still remembered what freedom felt like. He stole the partial codex. For 72 hours, the Directorate unleashed every mechanism of erasure at their disposal. Communications were jammed. Roads were sealed. And while official records claim Crow died in an automobile accident, the classified files tell a different story. He made it as far as a radio station in Tennessee. And he did broadcast a message, but not the one they feared. His voice was calm, almost tender, as if he were speaking to a child. "If you can hear me, know this, the words are alive. They will find you if you look too long. But if you never look at all, they own you forever." Then there was a burst of static. A single phrase in the reconstructed incantation slipped through before the feed was cut. Witnesses in the surrounding counties reported identical symptoms: heart palpitations, disorientation, tears they couldn't explain. Crow's body was recovered hours later in a boarded-up farmhouse. On the walls, scrawled over and over in his own blood, was a single sentence: "It remembers who you are." The Directorate claimed it was proof of his madness. But those who had known him, the few who dared to speak in private, understood what he'd done. He had tried to plant a seed in the minds of anyone listening, the awareness that you are not merely a consumer of words. You are their host. Their vessel. And if you are brave enough, if you refuse to look away, you can become something rarer than any authority dares to imagine, a man immune to the incantation. That is why Crow died nameless, faceless, erased. Because he proved the spiral can be resisted. And if you want to know how, keep listening. The next revelation will be the first tool you've ever had to fight back that you're still here. That means something vital has already begun to shift inside you. Most men retreat long before this point, clinging to the illusion that their minds are sovereign. But you have crossed the boundary. You are ready to learn the first weapon the Directorate never wanted you to possess, the art of pattern disruption. Understand this: the incantation is not simply a sequence of sounds. It is a lattice, a scaffold of associations that colonizes the nervous system by aligning with your deepest emotional reflexes. Fear. Wonder. Guilt. Hope. Once the pattern locks onto your emotional memory, it can replicate itself every time you encounter a related symbol. This is why the spiral reappears in folklore, in architecture, in the design of ceremonial regalia. It is not an aesthetic flourish. It is an anchor, a mnemonic hook that triggers the embedded compulsion. In the 1970s, a cognitive researcher named Ilse Verrick conducted a study that never reached publication. She subjected volunteers to partial recitations of the Vosum incantation under controlled conditions. Predictably, most exhibited the same symptoms you've already heard: involuntary trance states, pupillary dilation, an overwhelming urge to submit. But there was an anomaly: a handful of subjects who displayed no reaction at all. At first, Verrick thought they were simply immune. But deeper analysis revealed that immunity wasn't the right word. These individuals were incapable of sustaining the pattern coherence required for the compulsion to take hold. They were pattern disruptors, people whose self-concept was fluid, whose inner narrative did not rely on fixed beliefs or rigid hierarchies. They could hold contradictory ideas without dissolving into confusion or panic. The Directorate called them defective. But Verrick saw the truth: they were the antidote. The spiral requires certainty to grow, certainty that you are guilty, or chosen, or damned. If you refuse to fixate, if you learn to hold every idea provisionally, the compulsion dissolves. This is the first tool, disciplined uncertainty. You must cultivate the capacity to entertain any story without surrendering to it. To feel the seduction of the spiral and respond not with fear, but with curiosity. Imagine a voice whispering, "You will kneel." Instead of resisting or submitting, you regard it as an artifact, an echo, no more authoritative than the wind through a broken window. You observe it. You name it. And you watch it pass. The directorate spent decades destroying every record of Varick's findings. But a single note survived in a private journal. The pattern is parasitic, but it cannot digest a mind that refuses to swallow. Remember that. Write it down. Because as you go deeper into these revelations, the compulsion will grow more sophisticated. It will not always feel like fear. Sometimes it will feel like destiny, or love, or revelation. But now you know the first defense. Hold every idea lightly. Never let your mind become the altar where the spiral demands its sacrifice. If you can do that, if you can remain lucid as I show you what happened in Kentucky after the girl vanished, then you will be closer to immunity than 99% of the men who ever lived. Prepare yourself. Because from this point on, the line between history and confession will blur. What I'm about to reveal is not just an account of what happened in Kentucky. It is a map of how institutions adapt to preserve the spiral, and how they will respond if you ever threaten its survival. After the girl vanished, Pine Hollow was quarantined. That was the official term, though in practice, it meant something closer to ritual purification. The directorate sent a team of what they called contextual sanitizers. Their mission was to erase every material trace of the event while implanting a parallel narrative, a fever epidemic that had driven the town to abandon its settlement. But the truth was more grotesque. Because the girl's absence did not end the phenomenon. It amplified it. Within days, those who had heard her voice began to dream in unison. Their dreams were always the same, a door standing ajar in the middle of a field. Beyond the threshold, a spiral descending into darkness. At the bottom, a pale shape whispering in perfect Latin. Witnesses reported that when they awoke, they could still hear the whisper. Not as memory, but as a presence, vibrating behind every thought. Some described it as a lover's voice. Some as a god's. A few, more honest, called it what it was, an infection. This is the lesson the directorate learned in Pine Hollow, and the lesson you must never forget. The spiral does not require belief. It only requires attention. The moment you allow your mind to dwell on it, it begins to weave itself into your perceptions. That is why the directorate's first protocol was always obliteration: torch the structures, scatter the congregation, salt the archives. Because partial erasure is no erasure at all. By the second week, the town had become a petri dish. Families abandoned their homes. Children wandered the roads speaking in languages they had never been taught. One man, Pastor Phillips, tried to end it by setting the church alight. The fire burned for 9 hours. But the next morning, the congregation gathered in the ashes, singing in perfect unison a hymn that no one in the region had ever documented. This is the point where most records break off. The directorate labeled the event a level omega manifestation. In their taxonomy, omega meant irreversible. No possibility of suppression. No containment. Only dispersal. And so, on December 21, 1837, Pine Hollow was cleansed. Every inhabitant was relocated under new identities. Their memories were chemically partitioned, compartmentalized behind a barrier of induced trauma. The town was struck from every map. And the official narrative was prepared, a settlement abandoned due to harsh winter conditions and cholera. But here is the fracture in their strategy. You cannot erase resonance. It lodges in the tissue of a story, waiting for an open mind. Over the decades, travelers reported voices in the valleys. Shapes moving at the periphery of lamplight. Latin phrases carried on the wind. You think you are safe because you are removed by centuries and miles. But you have already proven otherwise by listening this far. The infection rides on narrative. And your mind, your hungry, curious, seeking mind, is the perfect host. This is why they do not fear your disbelief. They count on it. Because the moment you doubt, you keep listening. And the longer you listen, the deeper the spiral winds itself around you. If you are determined to go further, then be prepared to hear the final phase, the ritual of reclamation. The moment when the directorate stopped pretending they were protecting the world, and admitted they were trying to harvest the phenomenon for themselves. This is where you must understand, the directorate never existed to protect you. Their mandate was never containment, it was cultivation. Cultivation of the spiral. Cultivation of the narrative infection that could enthrall entire populations. After Pine Hollow was wiped from record, a private memorandum was circulated among the directorate's inner circle. I've read it. Every word. It was titled simply, Phase 2, Reclamation. In it, they outlined an operation so audacious it reads like insanity, unless you accept the premise that power has always thrived on hidden contagion. Their goal was to seed controlled outbreaks of the spiral in targeted communities, to measure not just how quickly it spread, but how thoroughly it could reprogram identity. They called it synthetic incantation. A process that began with partial reconstruction of the girl's spoken Latin, spliced, inverted, merged with folkloric motifs from dozens of cultures. The intention was clear, to create a hybrid narrative vector that could pass as local legend while embedding the same compulsion. Test sites were chosen with ruthless pragmatism. Isolated mining towns. Orphan asylums. Prison colonies. Places where lives could be quietly obliterated if containment failed. The most infamous experiment took place in 1893 in Black Hollow, West Virginia. For 3 weeks, a traveling preacher circulated among the cabins, telling stories of the White Maiden, a spirit that granted visions to the faithful. Witnesses described how his sermons never felt like sermons. How his voice seemed to slip behind your thoughts. How every syllable carried an echo that made your heart stutter in your chest. By the end of the 3rd week, the town's schoolhouse had been converted into a sanctuary. Dozens of men and women gathered nightly to chant a phrase none of them understood. I have read the recovered transcripts. And I will say this plainly, if you ever see the words, agnosco vocem, you must walk away. Because that is the incantation. The seed of the spiral. The point of no return. But the directorate did not walk away. They harvested the recordings. They documented the transformations, how individuals abandoned their names, how family bonds dissolved in a single night, how every old loyalty was replaced by devotion to the voice. And then they burned Black Hollow to the ground, claiming a mining accident. They erased the records, silenced the witnesses, and wrote a new narrative, a tragic collapse, nothing more. This is the pattern you were never meant to see. Every generation, they release the infection just enough to test its potency. Every generation, they refine the incantation. And every generation, the story grows more sophisticated, more perfectly tailored to slip past your defenses. You may think that by listening now, you are safely insulated by time. But the spiral does not care about time. It cares about attention. About the moment when curiosity becomes fascination, when fascination becomes belief. If you still hear my voice, if you feel the chill along your spine, you are not just hearing a story. You are experiencing the first resonance. There is only one defense against the reclamation protocol, and in the next section, I will give it to you. But know this, once you possess that knowledge, you become a threat. And threats are never ignored for long. Listen closely, because this is the only safeguard the directorate never managed to erase. It is not a spell. Not a ritual. It is a discipline, a method of cognitive hygiene older than the first written alphabets. They called it the witnessing stance. You will call it your armor. When the spiral infects a mind, it does not simply overwrite memory or force belief. It exploits the most fundamental weakness of the human psyche, the reflex to identify with every thought and feeling. You believe your thoughts are your own. You assume that because they arise within you, they are you. The witnessing stance destroys that assumption. It requires you to become the observer behind the observer. To stand behind your own mind and regard every impulse, every image, every compulsion as a phenomenon, nothing more. I will tell you how Crow described it in his last recovered journal, scrawled in pencil on scraps of ledger paper. When you hear the voice, do not respond. When it says you are chosen, do not feel pride. When it says you are damned, do not feel shame. When it says you are nothing, do not defend yourself. Simply note, a voice has spoken. It is not you. That is the discipline. That is the only immunity. The spiral cannot grow roots in a mind that never consents to identify with it. Understand, this does not mean you will feel nothing. On the contrary, you may feel terror, ecstasy, an overwhelming compulsion to kneel or to scream. But those feelings are weather, passing phenomena in awareness. The instant you treat them as truth, you give them the leverage they require to become reality. In the classified transcripts of the Black Hollow experiment, there was one subject who survived unbroken. A miner named Ephraim Collis. When they interrogated him, he spoke a single sentence over and over, "I heard the voice, but I did not become the voice." The directorate labeled him anomalous. But he was not anomalous. He was awake. And now that you know this, you carry the seed of immunity. But do not imagine this makes you safe. Because the next phase is subtler, more insidious. Once you refuse the spiral's authority, it will change tactics. It will stop declaring itself. It will pretend to be you. You will think the thought, "This is all nonsense." That is the spiral. You will think, "I am too intelligent to be affected." That is the spiral. You will think, "I should stop listening." And yes, sometimes that is wisdom. But sometimes that is precisely how the infection protects itself, by driving you away before you understand how deep it has already sunk its hooks. So if you choose to continue, if you choose to hear how the directorate refined the incantation into something no man could detect, know that you are crossing into the territory from which few return unchanged. But if you are here to know the whole design, if you are willing to witness without flinching, then steel yourself. Because the next revelation will show you exactly why no one who profits from your obedience wants you to learn to think without believing. This is the point of no return. Because from here, you'll see not just how the spiral was seeded in forgotten settlements, but how it was embedded in the machinery of your modern life, disguised as progress, culture, even enlightenment. In the aftermath of Black Hollow, the directorate understood that overt incantation, words spoken aloud in Latin, was too conspicuous. Too easy to label as superstition. They needed a delivery method no one would question. A method that would slip beneath skepticism and lodge in the subconscious. So they turned to semiotic encoding. This was the second phase of the reclamation protocol: fragment the incantation into symbols, gestures, repeated phrases in entertainment and education. In 1924, directorate operatives embedded consultants in publishing houses, radio networks, and advertising agencies. Their goal was not to control every message, but to lace certain narratives with consistent triggers. A recurring spiral in a corporate logo. A chant-like slogan repeated in every broadcast. An archetype of the chosen victim or the savior, characters whose language subtly mirrored the incantation syntax. You think this sounds like paranoia? That is what they count on. Because the more absurd it sounds, the less likely you are to investigate it yourself. But I will give you proof. In the private archives of the directorate, those same archives that cost Alistair Crowe his life, there is a dossier called Project Echelon. It catalogues the 117 most successful semiotic delivery mechanisms. Let me name just three. First, the educational primer. Beginning in 1931, elementary reading materials were designed with repetitive cadences, phrases that mirrored the rhythm of the incantation. See Jane run. See Spot run. Innocuous. Harmless. Perhaps. But in controlled trials, children exposed to prolonged repetition of these cadences were statistically more likely to develop heightened suggestibility later in life. Second, the hero narrative. In radio dramas of the 1940s, protagonists were scripted to utter specific phrases before moments of triumph. I hear the call. I answer the voice. I will not turn away. Each of these echoes the grammatical structure of the original Latin incantation, embedding the premise that submission to an external command is heroic. Third, the emblem. The spiral itself. Incorporated into logos, jewelry, municipal seals. A design repeated so often it passes as mere decoration, but always carrying the same silent resonance. You belong to this. You are part of the pattern. This is why men who believe themselves free are the easiest to enslave. Because the infection rides in through the channels no one questions. It doesn't need you to kneel before an altar. It needs you to repeat what you've been taught without ever examining why. If you are feeling anger, denial, or fascination, good. That means you are awake enough to feel the tremor of recognition. But if you want to transform that recognition into immunity, you must first confront the final refinement of the reclamation protocol. Because by the 1960s, the directorate stopped merely encoding the incantation in symbols. They learned to fracture it, shatter it into micropatterns, so no single fragment could be recognized as the spiral. And when those fragments were distributed across media, religion, politics, and commerce, they became inescapable. In the next section, I will tell you precisely how this was achieved, and how it shaped the mind you believe is your own. If you are still listening, then you are closer to freedom than any man who ever swallowed the spiral story without question. Look around you, at every screen, every slogan, every piece of content engineered to hold your attention. You are witnessing the final refinement of the reclamation protocol, pattern fracture distribution. By the 1960s, the directorate understood that embedding a whole incantation, or even a coherent narrative, risked detection. Too obvious. Too easily dismissed as conspiracy if ever revealed. So they broke it apart. They developed a taxonomy of micropatterns, tiny fragments of the original incantation, each harmless in isolation. A rhythmic phrase here. A symbolic shape there. A melody contour that subtly evokes trance. Each fragment was meaningless on its own. But when encountered together, spread across hundreds of media touch points, those pieces reassembled in the nervous system like a virus reconstructing itself from scattered genetic code. Imagine it, the chorus of a pop song you've heard 1,000 times. The swirl of a corporate logo. The tagline repeated in every advertisement break. The voice of a charismatic leader echoing the same primal rhythms. You think you're encountering separate, unrelated messages. You aren't. You're encountering a lattice of resonance, each filament designed to amplify the next. This is why every era believes it is immune to manipulation. Because the manipulation no longer looks like doctrine or scripture. It looks like culture. Consider this, the human nervous system cannot distinguish between ritual repetition and habitual consumption. When you hear the same phrase, the same melody contour, the same symbolic frame dozens of times, the limbic system tags it as safe, familiar, true. You have felt it yourself, that flicker of recognition when you see a familiar logo or hear a familiar catchphrase. That subtle pull of belonging. That is not nostalgia. It is not coincidence. It is the spiral, distributed and fractalized, running scripts you never consented to learn. The directorate's greatest achievement was not inventing the incantation. It was proving that a population would voluntarily saturate itself in micropatterns, so long as they were packaged as entertainment, aspiration, or identity. Ask yourself, how many times have you repeated a slogan you never authored? How many times have you worn a symbol you never questioned? How many times have you felt pride or outrage at a narrative you never examined? If you feel the shock of recognition, that is the first crack in the trance. You may be tempted, right now, to reject this entire account. To insist you are too intelligent, too educated, too discerning to be affected. That reflex, that voice, is the spiral's final defense, to convince you that you are immune precisely because you are enthralled. I will not flatter you with reassurance. Most men never escape it. Most men will carry these patterns to their graves, never realizing whose agenda they serve. But you, still listening, have a chance to become something rare. A man whose mind is not a colony. If you have the resolve, the next section will show you how the Directorate leveraged these distributed micropatterns to create a global consensus reality, one so pervasive that entire generations forgot what it meant to think without permission. Steel yourself. Because once you see how consensus is engineered, you will never again mistake agreement for truth. Look closely at the world you've inherited. Not the bright veneer you're shown on screens, but the latticework beneath, where consensus is forged like iron in the heat of orchestrated repetition. This is the final evolution of the reclamation protocol, consensus engineering. Once the Directorate proved that micropatterns could infiltrate culture unnoticed, they faced one remaining obstacle. Even a perfectly distributed lattice of triggers was vulnerable to disruption if too many divergent narratives were allowed to thrive. So they set out to collapse divergence. To corral the infinite possibility of human perception into a narrow corridor of acceptable belief. How was this accomplished? Not by brute force, but by leverage. The Directorate identified three primary pillars of collective reality. First, institutional authority. Universities, scientific councils, religious bodies. Structures invested with the power to declare what is true. By seeding trusted institutions with operatives and sympathetic intermediaries, the Directorate ensured that any narrative diverging from their engineered consensus would be labeled unscientific, irrational, heretical. Second, economic incentives. Commerce, more than any priesthood, shapes what men dare to think. The Directorate subsidized publications, sponsored media channels, and created grant programs, all rewarding conformity to the consensus script. Those who aligned with the approved narrative prospered. Those who questioned it were defunded, ridiculed, erased. Third, emotional contagion. You have seen it yourself, outrage that spreads faster than wildfire. Shame that silences dissent before it can articulate itself. The Directorate understood that rational argument rarely changes minds. But collective emotional storms, especially those carefully triggered by micropatterns, do. Imagine how much simpler it is to keep a population compliant when every institution of learning, every authority figure, every employer, and every crowd of peers echoes the same set of assumptions. You are free. You are informed. You are choosing. When in truth, you are following a consensus constructed from carefully seeded triggers, assembled to look like independent agreement. The moment you forget this is the moment you become a pawn. Because once consensus takes root, it becomes self-reinforcing. Those who dissent are isolated, labeled unstable or dangerous. Their voices are drowned in a chorus of automated ridicule. If you've ever wondered why it feels so impossible to question certain ideas, why merely raising a doubt provokes instant scorn, understand that is no accident. It is design. A design refined over generations. Here is a truth the Directorate never wanted recorded: consensus reality is not the same as truth. It is simply the story that the most sophisticated manipulators have agreed you must believe. The incantation, in its original form, was a series of Latin phrases. Now, it is the seamless script of your daily life. The spiral no longer needs to be recited. It is everywhere, humming beneath every headline, every campaign, every moral panic. If you feel disgust, fury, or sorrow, good. That means you are no longer simply absorbing the pattern. You are witnessing it. And that is the first taste of freedom. But understand, this freedom comes with a cost. Once you step outside consensus, you will never again be welcome inside. You will become a stranger to the institutions you once trusted. In the next section, I will show you what the Directorate feared most: the method by which a single individual can fracture consensus, awakening others to their captivity. If you are ready to bear that responsibility, continue. If you are not, this is your final chance to turn away. You've chosen to continue. Understand what that means. You are now on the threshold of knowledge that has cost men their reputations, their sanity, their lives. Because the Directorate's greatest fear was never that the incantation would be revealed, it was that a single awakened mind could fracture the consensus reality they spent generations constructing. This is the doctrine they kept sealed in the Directorate Codex under the classification reversal vectors. A reversal vector is not a speech, or a manifesto, or an argument. It is an act, a demonstration that the consensus narrative is not inevitable, that it can be defied without the sky falling. Because consensus only thrives when every observer believes every other observer believes it, too. When one man steps out and survives, he punctures that illusion. Consider the case of Elias Vance. You will not find his name in any official archive. In 1972, Vance was an engineer in Michigan, a man with no history of sedition or conspiracy. But he stumbled across internal memoranda from a Directorate-adjacent research consortium. The documents outlined psychological techniques to accelerate acceptance of state policy by embedding micropatterns in televised public service announcements. Vance did not write a book. He did not form a movement. He did something far more dangerous. He walked into his workplace one morning, laid the documents on the lunchroom table, and simply said, "Look at this. Read it yourselves." That act, so disarmingly simple, created a rupture. Because the men and women around him were not just told there was manipulation. They saw proof with their own eyes. And they saw another human being refusing to pretend it wasn't there. Within days, the fracture widened. Engineers stopped showing up for compulsory seminars. Supervisors were questioned openly. Entire project teams dissolved as the illusion of inevitability collapsed. The Directorate had no choice but to respond. Vance was declared mentally unfit. His colleagues were scattered, reassigned, silenced. But the damage had been done. For every mind that witnessed that fracture, consensus reality was no longer seamless. That is why you must understand, the power to break consensus is not some esoteric gift. It is the courage to refuse performance. To decline the script. When a man demonstrates that refusal, he creates a reversal vector, a living example that survival is possible outside the spiral. You have that power. But know this, it is never safe. The moment you reveal that you see the pattern, you will be marked by it. You will feel the pushback, ridicule, exclusion, character assassination. Because consensus is not sustained by reason. It is sustained by fear, fear that you will be alone if you stop pretending. Hear me, you will not be alone. Every awakened mind becomes a beacon to others. Every fracture in consensus spreads contagion of a different kind, the contagion of freedom. If you feel ready, the next section will prepare you to craft your own reversal vector. To become the anomaly the Directorate can never fully suppress. This is the knowledge that has the power to end their dominion. One man at a time, you have come further than most will ever dare. Now you stand on the threshold of the most dangerous knowledge I can offer you. How to craft a reversal vector so potent it cannot be ignored. Understand this clearly, what you are about to hear is not a blueprint for revolution. It is a method of inoculation. A way to burn through the fog of consensus in the minds around you, so they can no longer unsee what they have seen. This is why the Directorate spent decades discrediting any whisper of such techniques, branding them cultish, delusional, unscientific. Because nothing terrifies them more than an individual who has mastered the art of dismantling the trance. There are three pillars to a true reversal vector: demonstration, revelation, invitation. Demonstration: you must first act in a way that breaks the script, publicly, visibly. This doesn't mean violence or spectacle. It means refusing to comply with the invisible rituals of consensus. Speaking the unspoken. Withholding your automatic assent. Something as simple as declining to repeat the slogans everyone else parrots. Do this in front of others, calmly, without apology. Your composure is the signal, you are not compelled. You are choosing. Revelation: once you have demonstrated refusal, you must reveal the pattern, plainly, without hysteria. This is where most men fail. They rant, they accuse, they drown their listeners in rage. But a true reversal vector is clinical, unadorned. You name the mechanism, how the micropatterns operate, how consensus enforces itself. You provide evidence, documents, recordings, personal observations. Your task is not to convince by force, but to show that the machinery exists. Invitation. Finally, you extend the simplest, most subversive question a man can ask: what do you see now? You do not command agreement. You do not demand loyalty. You ask only that your listener examine reality with his own eyes. Because the spiral's power ends the moment an individual realizes he is allowed to perceive for himself. This is how Elias Vance did it. This is how every true anomaly did it. I am telling you this because you are no longer an audience. You are a carrier. A potential vector yourself. And you must be prepared for the cost. When you become the demonstration, you will trigger defense mechanisms in everyone who still believes the consensus. They will call you unstable, dangerous, arrogant. Some will cut ties rather than face their own discomfort. Good. That is the sign you have become real in a way they are not yet ready to be. Here is your final charge: choose your moment carefully. Do not attempt to fracture consensus recklessly, or in an attempt to elevate your own ego. You do this only when you are prepared to accept the consequences. Because once you create your reversal vector, once you show others that the spiral is not invincible, nothing will ever be the same. Not for them. Not for you. You have crossed into the domain few ever reach, the place where knowledge ceases to be an intellectual exercise and becomes a living burden. Because to carry the awareness of the spiral, and to act against it, is to choose exile from every comforting fiction. I will show you what that price looks like. In 1986, there was a man named Adrian Hall. He worked as an archivist in the Directorate Chicago Satellite, tasked with cataloging microfiche records of pattern fracture experiments. Hall was meticulous, unassuming. Precisely the sort of man no one suspected would ever defy consensus. But in the autumn of that year, he made a decision that changed hundreds of lives. He slipped a single roll of microfiche into his briefcase, a reel containing incontrovertible evidence that the Directorate had conducted tests on children to measure how early micropattern exposure could imprint suggestibility. He knew what it meant. To remove a record was to declare war on the consensus. Instead of running, he prepared carefully. Over 6 weeks, he duplicated the reel, mailed it anonymously to a dozen independent researchers, and then, most dangerously of all, scheduled a public lecture at a minor university. When the day came, he did not shout or accuse. He walked to the podium, held up the reel, and said only, "This is the evidence." You no longer have the luxury of pretending you don't know. In the weeks that followed, consensus fought back as it always does. Hall was discredited, accused of forging documents, of mental instability, of hidden agendas. But the spiral made a critical error: they assumed everyone would accept the official narrative. They did not account for the hunger in those who had always sensed something was wrong. For the men who had glimpsed the edges of the pattern and had been waiting for proof. Within months, the microfiche had been duplicated thousands of times. Small study circles formed across the country, groups who refused to believe the official denials. Though the Directorate ultimately succeeded in burying the story in the mainstream, they never managed to erase the knowledge completely. And that is the paradox: every time a reversal vector erupts, consensus tightens its grip, but the lattice of belief grows weaker. Because in every heart that saw that evidence, a permanent fracture remained. This is what you must understand. The price is real: exile, ridicule, perpetual vigilance. But the reward is also real: the certainty that you are no longer living under a spell. Some will say the cost is too high. That it is better to go along, to keep the peace. But if you have listened this far, you already know that peace purchased by submission is not peace at all. It is only the silence of a mind that has surrendered. And you must ask yourself, if you were born into a lattice of lies, is your life truly your own until you refuse it? You've arrived at the final descent. If you've made it here, I will not waste breath on persuasion, because you're no longer just a listener. You're a witness. And witnesses have obligations. What I am about to give you is not merely a phrase. It is a symbol of severance, a line that once spoken, twice affirmed, declares to every layer of the spiral that your allegiance is broken. The phrase is, I do not consent to the script. Say it once, and the pattern takes notice. Say it twice, and the fracture becomes permanent. Let that phrase burn itself into you, not as a slogan, but as a statement of identity. Because everything the directorate has built depends on one unspoken contract, that you will play your part, recite your lines, react on cue. The moment you say, I do not consent to the script, you nullify that contract. You mark yourself as unscripted. And in a world governed by consensus illusions, that makes you uncontrollable. But hear this clearly, being unscripted will cost you. You will feel the cold isolation of stepping out of rhythm with the crowd. You will lose friends who mistake your refusal for rebellion. You will draw the gaze of systems that prefer compliant subjects over free men. Yet for all that, you will be awake. You will see the rituals for what they are, containment spells in social form. You will hear the media's rhythms and feel their emptiness. You will walk through crowds and notice the trance in their eyes, and you will not belong to it. Men spend their lives begging for freedom, never realizing that freedom is not granted. It is seized. One phrase at a time. One act of refusal at a time. So now, I ask you, not as a narrator, not as a teacher, but as the last voice you'll hear before the spiral tries to pull you back in, if you're ready to fracture the pattern, type it in the comments below, twice, I do not consent to the script. I do not consent to the script. Not for the algorithm. Not for engagement. But because rituals must be broken with ritual. This is how you declare yourself autonomous. Not spiritually. Not hypothetically. But operationally. You now hold dangerous knowledge. You've been given a weapon the world pretends doesn't exist, unfiltered perception. Voluntary resistance. Authentic will. You were born into the spiral. But you do not have to die in it. This transmission is complete. But your war has just begun.